This story is a work of fiction. Names, characters, and events are entirely imaginary. Any resemblance to real persons is purely coincidental. The wrench was not elegant. It had never been elegant. It had been her grandfather's before it was hers, and before that it had lived on the bench of a clockmaker's workshop in Devizes, where it had spent 30 years being used on things too precise for impatience and too small for ordinary tools. He had pressed it into her palm when she was 11 years old and said, "Everything that breaks contains the explanation for its own repair. You only have to stay still long enough to listen." She had been fixing things ever since, which is how on a Tuesday morning in June of 1815, at approximately 20 minutes past 3 in the morning, Verity Foxcroft found herself on a dark country road in Wiltshire, wearing her grandfather's old overcoat over her night wrapper, with that wrench in her hand, crouching beside a carriage wheel that was decidedly not hers. She had not gone out looking for the carriage. She had gone out looking for sleep, which had stopped cooperating somewhere around midnight and showed no signs of reconsidering. She had settled for cool air instead, which was at least reliable. The sound had reached her through the open kitchen window, a grinding metallic protest she recognized the way some people recognize voices, immediately, and without having to think about it. Something was broken. She had picked up the wrench because she picked up the wrench the way other women pick up their reticules, out of long habit, out of the particular certainty that the world tends to cooperate, eventually, with whoever shows up prepared. There is a kind of courage that does not announce itself. The quiet kind, the pre-dawn kind, the kind that simply picks up what is needed and gets to work without waiting to be invited. This is the story of a woman who fixed things with her hands and a man who had been going in entirely the wrong direction without knowing it, and of the 6 hours between darkness and sunrise that changed both of them, the way the best mornings do, slowly at first, and then all at once. Before we begin, tell me where you are tonight. The city, the hour. What is outside your window right now? Leave it in the comments. I read every single one. The carriage had come to rest at an angle that suggested its final yards had been accomplished more by inertia than by intent, which was also approximately the coachman's assessment of the evening, offered at some length to no one in particular, since no one in particular was listening. Verity found the scene exactly as it had arranged itself. A very fine travelling carriage, tilted at an unfortunate slant on the verge of the Ashfield Road, its near side rear wheel at an angle that wheels were specifically designed not to achieve, one horse calm and one horse deeply unimpressed, and a coachman seated on a stone wall with the expression of a man who had made his peace with the situation and was now waiting for history to catch him up. She assessed the wheel first, because the wheel was the most important thing, and she had learned early that starting with the most important thing saved considerable time, even when other things were demanding attention more loudly. The rim had cracked, a clean break which was almost a mercy, and the pin securing the wheel to the axle had sheared at an angle that told her it had been under strain for some time before it gave. Not a sudden accident then, a slow problem that had been quietly worsening for miles, tolerating the road in the way of things that are nearly at their limit, but have not yet decided to admit it. She had seen this pattern before, in estate carts and farm wagons, in her father's ancient trap and in the watermill machinery that she serviced every autumn and twice in January, because the mill had complicated feelings about winter. In every mechanism that had ever passed through her hands, the break was never quite where the problem started. You had to look back along the chain of events to find the thing that had been wrong before anything else. The coachman noticed her approximately a minute after she had begun her inspection, which was a minute longer than it should have taken, and which she attributed charitably to shock. "Here," he said, not unkindly, in the tone of a man addressing a stray dog of uncertain intentions. "What's your business?" "The pin is sheared," Verity said, holding her lantern closer to the axle mount. "The wheel can be reset if the pin is replaced and the mount is packed correctly. Do you have a spare?" The coachman, a stout grey-headed man somewhere in his 60s, with the bearing of someone who had formed his opinions before 1800 and had found no compelling reason to revise them, stared at her. "In the toolbox," Verity said, nodding toward the back of the carriage. "There is usually a spare pin in the toolbox. Also, I will need the wheel brace if you have one." "I know where the toolbox is," the coachman said, with the measured dignity of a man whose professional competence has been questioned by a woman in a large overcoat in the middle of the night. "Of course you do," Verity said pleasantly. A pause settled between them with the particular quality of pauses that are won on points rather than by conviction. His name, she would learn eventually, was Perkins. He had been in service to the Halcourt family for 23 years, had driven through 3 counties in all weathers, and held strong opinions about the correct management of a broken wheel, which differed from her opinions primarily in that his involved waiting until morning and finding a blacksmith, and hers involved the tools already present, and the not unreasonable observation that morning was several hours away. He retrieved the toolbox. Pythagoras had followed her from the kitchen, as he always did when she went out at odd hours, because Pythagoras regarded himself as a supervisory figure and could not in good conscience permit unsupervised activity on his estate after dark. He was a large grey tomcat of advanced years and entirely settled opinions, and he arranged himself on the stone wall beside the coachman with the precise deliberateness of a magistrate taking his bench, surveying the scene with the expression of someone who has seen worse but does not intend to say so. The coachman looked at the cat. Pythagoras looked at the coachman. "That is Pythagoras," Verity said, without looking up from the axle. "He will not interfere. He only supervises." "Right," Perkins said in the tone of a man revising his expectations for the evening, in a direction he had not anticipated. She had the damaged pin identified and was calculating the packing requirements when the carriage door opened. She did not look up immediately, because the carriage door was Perkins's matter to manage, and she was managing the axle mount, and she had found in general that things went considerably more smoothly when each person attended to their specific problem rather than everybody attending to everybody else's. She heard boots on the road, the confident kind, broken in but not worn out, and registered them the way she registered most things, briefly, accurately, and then set aside until they became relevant. "What is the situation?" said a voice from somewhere above and behind her. It was a good voice, the kind that expected to receive information and had made this expectation so habitual that it had stopped sounding like an expectation and had started sounding simply like the way questions were phrased. "Split rim and sheared pin," she said without looking up. "I am packing the mount now. Perhaps 20 minutes if the spare pin is the correct gauge." A moment of silence. She heard him absorbing this, adjusting. "You are not," the voice said. "The coachman." "No," Verity agreed. Another silence. She selected the correct driver from Perkins's toolbox with the ease of someone who knows what she is looking for and does not require labels. "Do you need more light?" he said. It was, she thought, precisely the right question. Not "who are you" or "what are you doing" or any of the other questions that would have required her to stop what she was doing and account for herself. Just, "Do you need light?" It was the question of someone who had correctly identified the most useful thing he could contribute and was offering it without making an occasion of it. She revised her estimate of him upward, sight unseen. "If you could hold the lantern slightly to the left," she said. "Yes, there, thank you." He held the lantern. She began to work. He was, she could tell without looking directly at him, standing closer than was technically necessary to hold the lantern, within the radius of a working partner rather than a bystander, and doing so with the contained attention of someone who was watching and not simply waiting. She had encountered this quality before, in her father during the estate negotiations, and in her grandfather during the precision work. The ability to be entirely still, without being absent. It was considerably rarer than most people seemed to realize. She still had not looked at him properly. He had not introduced himself. There was something in this mutual arrangement of priorities, both of them attending to the wheel, neither requiring the other to perform introductions in the middle of a practical problem, that she found unexpectedly sensible. They were for the time being simply 2 people managing a broken thing, which was as honest a foundation for human cooperation as she had come across. "How far outside Chippenham are we?" she asked. 3 miles approximately, north." Verity sat back on her heels and looked up at him for the first time. He was tall. She registered this first because it was the most practically relevant thing, determining as it did where the lantern light was coming from. Dark-haired, somewhere in his early 30s, with a jaw that suggested stubbornness and eyes the color of warm amber that the lantern caught at an angle and made considerably more interesting. He wore a traveling coat of good wool, somewhat dusty from the road, and the expression of a man who was generally the most composed person in a given situation, and was not entirely certain that this was currently the case. "North," she said. "Yes." "London is south." He looked at her. She looked at him. Pythagoras on the wall looked at both of them with the serene patience of a creature who had not come out in the middle of the night to watch people state geographical facts at each other. "Yes," the man said after a moment. "It is." "Were you aware of this before you stopped, or—" "We were not," he said, which was not quite the answer to the question she had asked, but was considerably more honest than most people in his position would have been, so she awarded him the point. From the stone wall, Perkins said with some feeling, "I may have dozed, briefly." "Perkins," said the man in the tone of someone who had had this particular conversation before, likely several times, and had not yet identified a satisfactory resolution. "There was a junction," Perkins said. "In the dark. The mayor prefers north." "The mayor," the man said, "is not driving." "Not officially," Perkins allowed. The horse in question, a grey of considerable dignity named Sophocles, who stood with the placid authority of a creature entirely at peace with every decision he had ever made, demonstrated no remorse whatsoever. Verity turned back to the axle. There was a particular satisfaction in this kind of work, the clean logic of it, the way the problem presented its own solution if you looked carefully enough, rather than deciding what you wanted the answer to be. Her grandfather had said it was the same with clocks. Every mechanism that fails is also a mechanism that tells you exactly what it needs. You only have to listen without imposing. "The spare pin is the correct gauge," she said, because reporting good news was also efficient. "Hold the lantern steady. This part requires both hands." He held the lantern without another word. She worked. The road was quiet around them, in the way that country roads at 3 in the morning are specifically quiet. Not silent, but arranged differently than daytime. Insects. A distant creak she could hear from her bedroom window on still nights. The sound of Sophocles breathing with the deep contentment of a horse who has completed his journey and does not consider the direction to have been a material concern. The grass smelled of the day's warmth still releasing itself into the cooler air, threaded through with oil, and the specific metallic sharpness of worked iron. "Do you do this often?" he said. "Fix carriages." "Fix things." She considered the question while she seated the packing. "Everything at Ashfield that can be fixed, yes. It is more efficient than waiting for someone else to do it, and a number of things at Ashfield would wait a very long time." "Ashfield," he said, not asking exactly, cataloguing. "The estate, a mile west of here." She nodded toward the lane without stopping her hands. "My father is Sir Robert Foxcroft. He has gout and very strong opinions, which are individually manageable but collectively rather time-consuming, particularly when they interact with each other, which they do constantly." The sound he made might, in better light and with more context, have been a suppressed laugh. "And you manage the estate?" "And the estate," Verity said. "Hold slightly left again, please. Yes, thank you." They had been working for perhaps 40 minutes when Perkins fell asleep on his stone, which was so entirely unsurprising that neither of them remarked on it. The night had deepened around them, in the way nights do between 2 and 4 in the morning in the English countryside, which is to say it had not become darker, but had become more concentrated, as though the darkness were taking itself more seriously. The lantern made a warm circle of perhaps 6 feet in every direction. Beyond it, shapes, the hedge, the outline of the carriage, the still grey form of Pythagoras, who had at some point transferred himself from the stone wall to the carriage step, where he sat in the compact and perfectly deliberate manner of cats who have decided that the current location is superior to the previous one and do not feel the need to explain why. "He has made himself comfortable," the man observed. "He always does." Verity checked the packing with careful fingers, working by feel where the light did not quite reach. "He is technically not supposed to come outside at night. He regards the rule as advisory. A cat of independent judgment. A cat of very settled ideas about whose rules apply to whom." She felt the mount, solid, correctly seated. "He is 17, which in a cat is an age at which one has earned the right to one's opinions. My grandfather named him. He named the cat Pythagoras. He believed that animals were better served by names that set expectations high." She moved to the wheel rim, pressing along the split to test the packing. He had a cart horse called Theorem and a sheepdog called Parliament, which tells you everything you need to know about how he felt about Parliament. The man was quiet for a moment. Did Parliament justify the name? He herded things into corners and then refused to let them leave, Verity said. So yes. The sound was definitely a laugh that time, contained but genuine, and she heard in it something that surprised her slightly, warmth that had not been announced in advance, arriving without ceremony. She tightened a bolt and reached for the wrench, and he passed it to her before she had to ask, which was the second time he had done this, anticipated the tool correctly, and which she noted without comment. "Your grandfather," he said. "The clockmaker." She looked at him briefly. He was watching her hands with an attention that was not intrusive, but was thorough, the same quality he brought to the lantern, to the conversation, to everything apparently, as though he had decided that whatever was happening was worth understanding properly, rather than approximately. "He had a workshop in devices," she said. "Bracket clocks primarily. Pocket watches when someone brought him a commission he found interesting, which was rarer than his clients would have liked." She ran her thumb along the wheel rim, checking. "I spent my summers there as a child. He let me watch from the time I could sit still, which he said was the main qualification." "The quiet," the man said. "Yes, he meant the ability to stay inside a problem without deciding its solution before the problem has had an opportunity to tell you what it needs." She settled the wrench against the rim. "He gave me this when I was 11. She held it briefly, the weight of it settling into her palm the way familiar things do, not as a reminder but as a continuation. "He said that most people who fix things borrow someone else's tools and someone else's methods, and that what you need for good work is tools that know your hands." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was simply processing the information, filing it away. But then he said, "Do the tools know your hands?" It was not quite a question. "This one does," Verity said. The silence that followed had something in it, not discomfort but weight. The comfortable weight of a thing said that was true. "I do not fix things," he said. "I am told I tend to demolish them instead." "Demolishing is also efficient," she said, "if you are certain what needs to go." "I have occasionally been certain when I should not have been." "That," Verity said, "is a different problem from the tools." He laughed again. More breath than sound, but she heard it, and she felt him shift his position slightly beside her, settling in with the ease of a man who had learned somewhere along the way that some processes cannot be hurried, which was either wisdom or long experience, and was generally both. "Tell me about the wrench," he said. It was a curious thing to ask. She told him. About the workshop and the clockmaker's bench, about the smell of oil and old wood, and the fine metal dust that settled on everything. About her grandfather's hands, large, very precise, always slightly stained with something even after washing, which her grandmother had accepted with the philosophical resignation of a woman who understood that the things that make a man useful are rarely the things that make him tidy. About the summer she was 11, when he had been in the middle of disassembling a bracket clock of considerable complexity, and she had sat beside him on a stool for 3 hours without being told to, passing tools before he could reach for them, not saying anything, and how at the end he had looked at her over his spectacles and said, "You have the quiet. That is the part that cannot be taught. The rest can be learned." He listened without interrupting, which was another thing rarer than people tended to think. The spare pin held. She tested it 3 times, the way her grandfather had taught her to test anything important. Once for confidence, once for doubt, and once for the thing you might have missed in the first 2 passes. It seated correctly. The packing was solid. She checked the opposite wheel while she was there, because her grandfather had believed firmly that you never repaired one side of a carriage without inspecting the other 3, an opinion she had initially considered excessive and had subsequently found correct on 2 separate and moderately dramatic occasions. "The other wheels are sound," she said, straightening up. She pressed her palms together briefly, feeling the warmth returning to them. She always lost a little in close work in the cool night air. He was watching her with an expression she had not quite seen from him before. Not surprise exactly, but something adjacent, the particular look of a person who has been updating their assumptions about a situation and is perhaps 2 or 3 updates behind the actual situation. "Fayu checked all 4, he said. "It would be careless not to. Most people would not have known to." "Most people," Verity said, "are not paying attention." She returned the tools to the box in the order she had found them, which was the correct order, laid out by someone who knew their business, even if that someone was currently asleep on a stone wall at 4 in the morning without apparent embarrassment. Perkins snored once and resettled. 3 estates, she said, returning to what he had mentioned earlier because she was interested in it. That is a considerable amount of management. It is. He was quiet a moment. The northern 2 have good stewards. The southern one is the difficulty. What kind of difficulty? The kind that has an excellent explanation for every problem and no solutions. A pause. He is also extremely agreeable in person, which makes the conversations longer than they need to be. Verity considered this. My father's previous land agent was very fond of round numbers, she said, and very agreeable about them. Round numbers in accounts. In all accounts. Rents, costs, expenditures. Everything arrived in a form that was extremely tidy and bore a reassuring relationship to arithmetic, without necessarily bearing the same relationship to the actual figures. He looked at her with an expression that suggested he was familiar with this type of person, in the way that one is familiar with a weather pattern one has not yet found the means to prevent. What did you do about him? I kept my own ledger, Verity said, in parallel for 18 months. Then I put both ledgers on the table in front of him and my father and asked which set of numbers they preferred to rely upon. And? He retired to Taunton. He seems very happy there. He sends a card at Christmas. Better than he deserved, the man said. It depends on how one feels about round numbers. She looked at the repaired wheel, running one final check by eye. He was not dishonest in the way that is dramatic. He was dishonest in the way that accumulates quietly, which I have found is considerably more expensive. Yes, he said, and there was something in the single word, a recognition rather than an agreement, that made her glance at him. The lantern was between them, and in its light, his face had the quality of someone who spent most of his time being careful about what he let show, which she found interesting primarily because he had not, over the course of the past 2 hours, been particularly careful with her, as though the dark road and the broken carriage and the mutual project of the repair had suspended the usual conditions. She picked up the wrench, and he reached for the lantern at the same moment, and their hands arrived at the same point in space, not touching but near enough that she was aware of the near, and they both drew back slightly in opposite directions, which resolved the situation without requiring anyone to remark on it. To the left side, she said a moment later. Can you hold it to the left? He moved the lantern. She finished the check. It will hold, she said, for London and well beyond, if Perkins manages to stay awake at the junctions. I will ride up with him, the man said, for the first hour at least. That will help considerably. I was thinking more of myself than of you, he said. In the dry tone she was beginning to recognize as how he indicated that he was making a joke, delivered without apparent change in expression, which she found she preferred to the kind of person who announced they were being amusing before being it. It is possible, Verity said, to have an interest in both outcomes simultaneously. He looked at her. Then he laughed, brief, unguarded, the kind that arrived before the decision to allow it, and the sound of it in the quiet road was so unexpectedly warm that even Sophocles lifted his head briefly to consider it. She sat on the carriage step to rest her hands, because they ached in the way that was not unpleasant but was worth acknowledging, and he sat beside her on the same step without being invited, which was either familiarity or simple practicality, and which she found she did not mind. It was a narrow step. His shoulder was perhaps an inch from hers. Neither of them mentioned this. Pythagoras performed a precise and unhurried migration from the carriage step to Verity's lap, settling himself with the arrangement of a creature who has surveyed the available options and selected the most appropriate one. She set her hand on his back, feeling his warmth against her palms, which were still cool from the metal. Perkins had not stirred. The horse Sophocles stood in the road with the equanimity of a philosopher who has long since made peace with the indignities of the world and finds them, on the whole, not worth the energy of response. I don't know your name, she said. She had not asked before because names were things people managed to introduce when names were relevant, and for the past 3 hours they had been managing something else. But the sky was changing, not yet visibly, but audibly, in the way the very early morning has of producing a different quality of silence, before it produces any light, as though the birds and the insects are performing a brief and respectful interval before the next movement begins. Names were becoming relevant. "Leander," he said, "and yours?" "Verity." He was quiet for a moment. "It suits you," he said, not as a compliment exactly, but as an observation. "Most names don't suit people," she said. "I was fortunate." "Leander," he said in a tone that suggested he had thought about this before, "is the name of a figure from classical mythology who drowned in pursuit of a woman he was not supposed to love. My mother chose it because she was romantic in ways that my father was not, and had sole charge of the naming in that particular instance. I have spent my life finding it either apt or ironic, depending on the week. It was rather a great deal to say about a name, but she was beginning to understand that he either said a great deal or said nothing at all, and that the nothing was considerably more common, which made the great deal more interesting when it arrived. "And Hero," Verity said, "what do you make of her?" He looked at her sideways in the dark. She kept the lamp burning so he could find his way. "Until the storm." "Until the storm," he agreed. Neither of them said anything further, because neither of them needed to, which was a kind of conversation she had not had very often, and found she valued considerably. The darkness had acquired a quality of waiting. She was aware of it the way she was aware of the pre-dawn shift when she woke early in summer. Not a change in anything visible, but a change in the expectation of visibility, as though the dark itself was holding a breath. She was also aware, in a separate and more immediate register, of the distance between his shoulder and hers, which had not changed, but which she was finding she noticed more than she had an hour ago, of the way he held his hands in his lap, loosely, without particular purpose, the hands of a man accustomed to having things in them, of the quality of his attention, which remained the same in conversation as it had been when he was holding the lantern, complete and not pressing. Pythagoras shifted in her lap, found a marginally superior arrangement and resettled. "He trusts you," Leander said, looking at the cat. "He trusts himself," Verity corrected, "his judgment about where to place himself. It happens to coincide with my lap at present, which is convenient for both of us. There is something to be said for that approach." Pythagoras would agree. A bird made a single tentative sound from the direction of the hedge, as though testing whether morning was ready to receive it. Then silence again. "You said your mother was romantic," she said. "Was she right?" "About what?" "The name. Whether it turned out to be apt or ironic." He was quiet for long enough that she thought she had asked too much, that she had pressed past the point where the suspended conditions of the dark road held. But then he said, "I have not yet drowned, but I have been swimming in the wrong direction for some time, apparently." He said it quietly, and with the particular quality of a thing said truthfully that has not previously been put into words. She did not answer immediately. She looked at the road ahead, and the place where the darkness was just beginning to soften at the edges, and she thought about wrong directions and what it took to recognize them. "The wrench," she said. "Grandfather's principle. Everything that breaks contains the explanation for its own repair." "So you only have to stay still long enough to listen," he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the road ahead with an expression she could not entirely read in the changing light. Something considered and arrived at, and not quite finished. The sky was beginning to turn. It came the way it always does, which is to say gradually and then with a kind of inevitability that made the gradual part feel like a formality. First the hedgerows resolved from shapes into details, the architecture of the old hawthorn, the gap in the stone wall where the fox came through in winter, the lane running west toward Ashfield that she had walked since before she could remember and could identify by its own specific smell of chalk and grass and distance. Then colour. The grey road, the brown earth, the green of the field beyond the hedge, all arriving in the order nature intended, without urgency, like guests who have been waiting outside and have too much breeding to make an entrance before they are ready. She felt him turn to look at her before she turned to look at him. In the full light of early morning, he was someone she could have met in a different story, a more ordered story, with a drawing room and a letter of introduction and the proper social machinery in place. He was very composed, very well made. The kind of man that London drew toward important things as a matter of course, the kind who moved through rooms without appearing to take up the space, and yet somehow occupied all of it. She registered this in the way she registered the repaired wheel. Complete, now visible, not previously in doubt but now confirmed. She registered also, now that the light permitted it, that his coat was not merely good wool, that his boots were not merely well fitted, that there was about him the particular quiet of a person who did not need to announce what he was. "Your Grace," said Perkins, materializing from his stone wall with the abruptness of a man who has slept through events and has arrived at the conclusion that something requires his professional attention, "the mare is ready when you are." Verity's hands went still on Pythagoras's back. She turned and looked at Leander. He looked at her. There it was. She felt it the way she felt a mechanism click into its correct position. Not wrong exactly, but newly defined, a rearrangement of what she had been looking at. She was Verity Foxcroft of Ashfield, daughter of a country baronet with gout, sitting on the carriage step of someone who was addressed as Your Grace, in her grandfather's overcoat, with oil on her hands, and her hair in a braid that had not been designed for company, and Pythagoras in her lap behaving as though he had arranged this entire situation deliberately, which, this being Pythagoras, was not outside the bounds of possibility. "You didn't mention," she said. His expression did not change. "You didn't ask." "No," she said slowly. "I didn't." She moved Pythagoras from her lap with the care she always gave him, and stood and picked up the wrench from the carriage step where she had set it. Its weight settled into her hand. I suppose that was a mutual arrangement. "I found it efficient," he said, standing also. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something less managed than the knight's composure, more direct, as though the light had rearranged some things for him too. "Miss Foxcroft," he said. "Not a question." "Sir Robert Foxcroft's daughter, yes." She looked at the repaired wheel, which was straight and solid, and would take him to London without incident, and then at the lane to Ashfield, which was dappled with the morning's first light and smelled of dew and early grass. And she thought about her father getting up at 6 o'clock regardless of gout or anyone else's advice, as he had done every day of his adult life, to sit in the morning room with his first coffee and his newspaper and his settled opinions about the morning. And she thought about walking back along the lane with Pythagoras and the wrench, and the 6 hours behind her that felt, peculiarly, like considerably more. "I should," she began. "Your full name," he said. "And your direction." She looked at him. "I intend to call this afternoon," he said, "if Sir Robert receives." He said it with the certainty of a man reporting a decision that had been made, not requesting permission, but not demanding it either, stating a fact that had not yet occurred, and treating it as though it already had, which was either presumption or confidence, and the difference between them, she was finding, depended entirely on whether you minded. She found she did not mind. "My father receives between 2 and 4 in the afternoon," she said. "He has strong opinions about punctuality as well as everything else." 2 o'clock. "You still have to reach London first." "London can wait." She looked at him in the early morning light, in his travelling coat, with 3 nights of road behind him and the particular quality of stillness that she had spent 6 hours learning, and she thought, well, this is not what I came out for. "I charge," she said, "for repairs." He blinked. Then he laughed. A full one, longer than anything she had heard from him in the 6 hours previous, arriving without any apparent intention of being contained, and Perkins, who had been walking towards Sophocles with the bridle and had not anticipated the sound, startled and walked directly into the wheel housing, which Verity had just repaired with some care. The wheel held, which was satisfying. Perkins made a sound of profound indignity. Verity looked at the wheel. She looked at Perkins. She looked at Leander, who was still laughing. "That," she said, "will cost you more." He pressed his hand briefly over his mouth, recovered himself, and said, "I will bring sufficient coin." 2 o'clock, she said. "Do not be late." He has very little patience for late. She tucked the wrench under her arm, gathered Pythagoras with the ease of 17 years of practice, and walked back toward Ashfield along the lane in the early morning sun, with the sound of a man laughing behind her and a cat regarding everything with the composed satisfaction of a creature whose supervisory role had produced exactly the expected outcome. She did not look back. It took more effort than she had anticipated. Her father was in the morning room when she came in, as he always was at 6, sitting in his chair by the window with his first coffee and his newspaper, the gout foot propped on its cushion, looking precisely as he had looked every morning of her life, except for the brief period when he had been well enough to stand for it. He surveyed her over his reading glasses. "You have oil on your face," he said. "Good morning, father?" "You also have that look." "What look?" "The look," Sir Robert Foxcroft said, setting down his coffee cup with the deliberateness of a man who considers this conversation to require his full attention, "that your mother used to get when she had made a decision and was waiting for the world to catch her up." Verity set Pythagoras down on the chair arm, where he arranged himself with minimal disruption to Sir Robert's coffee and maximum proximity to the window, and looked at her father for a moment. "We may be receiving a caller at 2 o'clock, she said. "Maybe," he said, "will be." Sir Robert looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Pythagoras, who had the settled expression of a creature who had been present for the relevant events and considered the outcome to be within the expected parameters. "I will have Mrs. Gould put out the good tea," Sir Robert said, and opened his newspaper. Outro. The following is taken from a letter written by Verity Halcourt, formerly Miss Verity Foxcroft, to her sister, Miss Cecily Foxcroft, then residing in Bath for her health, dated the 3rd of September in the year 1815. It was written approximately 3 months after the events described above. "My dear Cecily, you have now asked me 3 times how it happened, and I have given you a different answer on each occasion, which I acknowledge is unlike me. The difficulty is that the true answer is not particularly tidy, and I know you have been expecting something in the drawing-room and candlelight tradition, which I am afraid I cannot provide. I can give you something better, or at least more honest, which I hope you will accept as a reasonable substitute. I went out at 3 in the morning because I could not sleep. I took grandfather's wrench because I always take grandfather's wrench. I found a broken carriage on the Ashfield Road, and a coachman who had located a suitable stone and was conducting a peaceful negotiation with fate, and a man standing in the dark who asked practical questions and held a lantern correctly without having to be shown twice. He did not ask my name until I offered it. He gave me his name before his title, which I mention only because most people do it the other way round, and the order of a thing always tells you something about the person behind it. He called at 2 o'clock precisely, which pleased father considerably, as father has strong feelings about punctuality that generally go unmet by the people who know him. They spoke for 45 minutes about the Ashfield watermill, during which time father explained his position on millstone maintenance to a degree that most men find exhausting, and Leander listened without pretending to understand more than he did, and asked 3 questions that father later described as showing a sound grasp of the fundamental principles. Pythagoras went to sleep on his boot. You and I both know what that means. We married in August. You were in Bath, which I am choosing to attribute to your health rather than to any failure of planning on your part, since I prefer to think well of you. I should tell you now because you will find out eventually. Leander attempted to repair grandfather's bracket clock last Tuesday, the one in the library. He was methodical and confident about it, which is how he approaches most things, and he had it in 4 pieces before he noticed I was standing in the doorway. The expression on his face was precisely what you would expect from a man who has just demolished something he intended to fix in the workshop of his wife, who is, professionally speaking, considerably better at this than he is. I did not say anything immediately. I sat down beside him. I put the clock back together, and while I worked I told him what grandfather told me because it seemed like the appropriate moment. Everything that breaks contains the explanation for its own repair. You only have to stay still long enough to listen. He stayed very still. He has not attempted the clock again, but he has taken to sitting in the workroom in the evenings while I work, which I find I like more than I expected to. He reads, or he watches, or he asks questions about the mechanisms in the precise tone of a man who is paying attention rather than being polite. Pythagoras sits between us on the bench, with the satisfaction of a creature whose judgment has been comprehensively vindicated. I am, Cecily, unexpectedly and thoroughly content. I mention this only because I know you worried. You may stop. Give my love to Aunt Margot. Tell her the willow bark preparation I sent works best taken in the evening with warm water rather than cold, which I know she will argue with but which the evidence supports. I charge Leander for repairs. He brings coin. We have not agreed on the rate. which means the negotiation continues, which suits both of us rather well. Your sister, Verity, stories told with quiet love.
When the light finds us in the hush before the dawn, when the world was still and warm, she was moving through the dark with an old wrench in her hand, and the road was cold and long, but her heart knew where it belonged, to the quiet things that break and the courage they demand. Then a voice came through the night, gentle as a question asked right, and he stood there holding light like he knew her all along. And when the light finds us, it finds the truth beneath the pain. It finds the hands that gently mend what time has torn away. And if the road is lonely, if the world has gone too far, there's a place where love is waiting in the tenderness of dawn. He was walking in the wrong direction, she was patient with the rain. Neither one had come in search of something they could name, but the wheel was cracked and waiting, and the sky was slowly changing, and the silence between them became softer than the name. He had been swimming against the tide, she had learned to trust the light, and the broken things around them began to feel alive. And when the light finds us, it finds the truth beneath the pain. It finds the hands that gently mend what time has torn away. And if the road is lonely, if the world has gone too far, there's a place where love is waiting in the tenderness of dawn. Every crack holds the answer, every silence tells the way, every heart that stays still long enough will learn what words can't say. And the road we thought would lead us out may lead us home instead, when the morning lifts its golden hand and writes hope across the edge. And when the light finds us, it finds a love we couldn't name, the kind that grows in quiet hours and blooms despite the pain. And if the night is fading, if the dark has come and gone, there is grace in every